If the Bible isn't reliable, is the resurrection still true? Dr. Gary Habermas says yes. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Gary Habermas is a Christian New Testament scholar. He's considered to be one of the foremost defenders of Jesus' resurrection. His minimal facts approach has become a staple in the apologetics community for the past couple of decades. The clip that we're about to watch is from a recent interview with Dr. Frank Turek. The topic of the show was about Gary Habermas' advice to doubting Christians. As someone who does regular one-on-one counseling with people struggling with doubts, naturally my ears perked up. So let's hear what he has to say.
Lacona and I do this a lot. We'll get a question from the crowd. All right, you just lectured on the resurrection. Did the resurrection happen? Questions. Here's the first question. If Jesus was raised from the dead, what do you do with the genocide passages in the Old Testament?
Mm-hmm.
And Mike and I will kind of look at them. We don't do this all the time. You have to be careful. But we'll look at them. We'll go, all right, so what's your point? I'll hold up a little Bible. Here's one I hold up. I'll say, if this book is inspired, is Jesus raised from the dead? Oh, yeah. If it's inspired, it's not. But if it's inspired, yeah, there's a resurrection. What if it's just reliable? It's not inspired. Well, it depends on what's reliable. Okay, that's a really good answer. But what if this book is unreliable? Then we're in trouble. But no, we're not. Not on the resurrection. Because I will take Rudolf Bultmann's facts, Bart Ehrman's facts, Garrett Ludemann's facts, the last two atheist New Testament scholars. I will use their data. The Jesus Seminar rejects 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus. Okay, good. I'll use the 10%, or even less. And I will use their data and show you that Jesus is raised from the dead. That's the best explanation. So, here's my answer to your question. Yeah, genocide passages could be the hardest question in the Bible. Could be. The most common objection to the New Testament for 220 years, from Schleiermacher in 1799 to the present, the most common objection is there's contradictions in the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
And here's my response.
I know.
So?
All right.
Do you think there's contradictions? No, I don't. But what's your point?
Yeah.
Well, there's contradictions. So?
Uh-huh.
Even on contradictions, you have a death, burial, resurrection, and heaven.
Now, don't get me wrong. I think Dr. Habermas is extremely intelligent and is a very good man. But this is Exhibit A of why I am not a fan of the minimal facts approach.
I don't like it.
There are some major problems here, but before I dive in, we should probably back up and bring some of you up to speed as far as what the minimal facts approach for the resurrection is.
Let me bring you up to speed. Come on.
For something to count as a minimal fact, it has to have a high majority of scholars who grant it. This has to include scholars across the ideological spectrum, including skeptics. This is why Dr. Habermas is name-dropping skeptical scholars who disagree with his conclusion, like Bart Ehrman or Gerd Ludemann. So, what are some of these facts that even the vast majority of skeptical scholars acknowledge? Number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, very soon afterward, Jesus' disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the resurrected Jesus. And number 3, Paul, who was previously persecuting the church, converted to Christianity based upon what he thought was a post-resurrection appearance of the risen Jesus. The biggest reason that skeptics grant this is because of a creed found in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. The creed reads, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and to the 12. Paul also includes himself and James and a group of 500 unnamed people in the next few verses. The majority of New Testament scholars believe that this creed was early and not something that Paul himself came up with, but was a tradition that he received. Now you might be tempted to think, wow, that's cool. Wow. We have early appearances and even skeptics have to admit it. With these three facts in hand that even skeptical scholars grant, plus add in an argument for the empty tomb or two, Habermas believes that he can rule out all alternative naturalistic hypotheses to the resurrection. That would leave the resurrection as the best explanation for the data.
Checkmate.
But here's the rub. As philosopher Lydia McGrew has pointed out, just because the Bart Ehrmans or Gerd Ludemans of the world grant appearances, it doesn't mean that those appearances were like those described in detail in the gospel accounts. Not enough scholars across the ideological spectrum acknowledge that. Ehrman says that if there were some kind of group appearances, it was probably something like the disciples seeing Jesus from a great distance and just being mistaken in thinking that it was him. Gerd Ludemann says that the disciples were seeing into the spirit, aka not real, and that the appearances can be explained away by psychological phenomena. The big problem for Habermas's argument is that the minimal fact of appearances could include far more weaker, limited appearance experiences. Habermas is counting those who explicitly deny or are deeply skeptical about the authenticity of the details of the resurrection accounts as acknowledging the appearances. The fact is that there are plenty of scenarios that are consistent with the appearance fact. The disciples could have seen a floating, non-speaking Jesus, or a Jesus who only appears once briefly, speaks few words, and disappears. These scenarios already assume at least one group experience and at least one visual component as of Jesus appearing before them, but they're still incredibly weak, or as in the first case, could even disconfirm bodily resurrection. Now, be sure to pay attention here because I'm not just splitting hairs. This is a big problem for the minimal facts argument. If we're not able to say in detail what the experiences were like, it's extremely difficult to evaluate the rationality of the disciples' beliefs. The reason skeptical scholars are, skeptical of the resurrection appearances isn't only because they're so biased against the supernatural. Now, I'm not saying that anti-supernatural bias can't be a factor, but it's largely because they believe that the physical details found in the Gospels are later embellishments. 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't tell us anything about what the appearances were like, other than the disciples believed that they were physical, but believing doesn't equal rational. People believe in lots of strange things based on weak reasons. We need much more than a brief and vague report. This is why we can't say that even if the Gospels are unreliable, we can prove that Jesus rose from the dead. If the Gospels are really riddled with contradictions and don't reliably record at least what the witnesses claimed about the resurrection appearances, it's totally plausible that the disciples did not have the experiences that made them rational in believing that Jesus was physically risen. After all, that's why somebody had to invent such experiences and put them into the Gospel accounts. Are you seeing the problem yet? Make sure that you get this. If the Gospels are full of fictitious stories and are unreliable documents, then the skeptic could just easily ask, why did the Gospel writers need to invent fake stories about interactions with the risen Jesus if they really were true stories? On the flip side, if these group seeing, hearing, and touching details do not go back to the original eyewitnesses, it's very unlikely that they were mistaken to think that Jesus rose from the dead. And if they were preaching this message in the streets in the face of persecution and suffering, then it's also highly unlikely that they were lying. So the best explanation would be that Jesus really rose from the dead. The fact is, we do have highly reliable gospels in order to make such a case. Fortunately, that's exactly what we have and what I'm prepared to argue for. I have dozens of videos on the reliability of the gospels that you can find here on this channel. Another big problem with Habermas's argument is, if we don't have reliable scriptures, how exactly are we going to understand the theological implications of Jesus rising from the dead? If I were to guess, I think Dr. Habermas might say that we could just look to the letters of Paul that even skeptical scholars grant as genuine. That would include Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. And he might also include the words that even skeptics grant Jesus really spoke. And sure, we can get plenty of doctrine out of that, including a high Christology, knowledge on how to be saved and live a good Christian life. After all, Paul was given the right hand of fellowship from the Jerusalem apostles and said that he preached the same gospel they did. But it's a pretty well-known liberal position that Paul hijacked Christianity and later on preached far beyond what Peter, James, and John ever taught. Liberal scholars will even say that Paul was in conflict with what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching. How does the minimal facts proponent get around that? I'm not sure that they can. We just can't do it all with the Apostle Paul. Finally, if God is a moral monster in the Old Testament like skeptics make him out to be, that would show that Paul and Jesus had some false beliefs about God. This would lower our confidence that Jesus was really God and that his followers were really inspired by God. I agree with Habermas that these problem passages should not be central, nor are they unanswerable, and the resurrection really should be front and center. But these questions are relevant in regards to how much evidence is actually needed in order to justify belief in the resurrection because they make Christianity less plausible. If these troubling passages mean that there's more evidence required to be a Christian, then only being able to offer mere belief in undetailed physical appearances without any sort of descriptions of what those appearances were like just isn't going to cut it. For these reasons, saying that we can have an unreliable Bible, but Christianity can still be true, doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Doesn't add up.
This definitely would not be the advice that I would give a doubting Christian, especially when we have an embarrassment of riches for the reliability of the Gospels in the book of Acts. Now, at this point, Habermas and Licona would object to using a more maximal approach because it is just inefficient and just takes too much time. Let's hear what they have to say.
Why are you doing it? If you know that you only have a limited amount of time, why would you go off on a maximal approach? If I'm involved in a public debate and I only have 20 minutes to give an opening statement, I don't have time for a maximal approach. And even if I wanted to give, let's say, an outline for a maximal approach, I'm not going to have time to really fill in all the blanks with it. I can only give an outline. I can barely go further than that in 20 minutes with a minimal facts approach.
Yeah.
So, why are you doing it? So I think that'd be the main question.
Let's just say that Dr. Licona is right and a maximal case would take too long. Well, based on what we've already discussed, a minimal case just isn't sufficient to establish that the disciples were rational when it comes to believing in the resurrection. Also, not everybody that you're going to have a discussion with or a debate with is going to accept the minimal facts. Dr. Robert M. Price is a Jesus mythicist. Both Dr. Licona and Dr. Habermas have debated him. Also, there's Richard Carrier, who Licona has debated. They don't accept the minimal facts, and so it isn't necessarily this rhetorically powerful thing, just in and of itself. At least not all the time. Also, it's just a myth that one cannot state the maximal case in a quick and easy manner. In fact, I already did it in this video. On the flip side, if these group seeing, hearing, and touching details do go back to the original eyewitnesses, it's very unlikely that they were mistaken to think that Jesus rose from the dead. And if they were preaching this message in the streets in the face of persecution and suffering, then it's also highly unlikely that they were lying. So the best explanation would be that Jesus really rose from the dead. Fortunately, that's exactly what we have and what I'm prepared to argue for. I have dozens of videos on the reliability of the Gospels that you can find here on this channel. I mean, seriously, how long did that take? Any case for the resurrection, whether it bills itself as a minimal facts case or not, will start with certain assumptions that can be backed up by additional facts if challenged. This support will not be brought up spontaneously, but only if needed. The cases here are actually very similar in this regard. But Dr. Licona and Dr. Habermas have another objection.
And then another thing I would just add to that is if you do a maximal or holistic approach, as you're calling it, and you add some things, let's say you add gospel reliability, you risk the chance that when you are engaged in a conversation with someone, that they will bring up something like, let's say, contradictions in the Gospels. And then you get off on a rabbit trail, which is really unnecessary, and talking about biblical inerrancy, divine inspiration, how to resolve these, are they reliable because the contradictions, was there one angel or were there two at the tomb? Potential errors such as the Quirinius being governor of Syria when Augustus did the census. Okay. So, what if Luke got it wrong? Well, that doesn't mean that Jesus did not rise from the dead. Right. And so by doing more of the holistic approach, you do risk with everything that you add to it, you risk the chance of just getting off on one of these rabbit trails. Whereas with the minimal facts approach, there are far, far fewer rabbit trails on which you can go.
The pushback that I'd offer here is that the skeptic doesn't get to dictate when and where you address alleged contradictions. You're making a positive case. The refusal to not stop then and there and answer their particular concern is not the same thing as granting an error or a contradiction for the sake of argument. And when dealing with eyewitness testimony and historical records, we should expect some variation between accounts. But skeptics like Bart Ehrman have argued through a lot of bullying rhetoric, I might add, that the Gospels contain a world of contradictions that make them unreliable. His laundry list of examples looks impressive if you don't scratch beneath the surface, but if you dig a little bit further, you find that Ehrman and others are really trying to sell people a bill of goods. Ehrman's examples are often generated by incomplete quotes, silly, ridiculous readings, translations, arguments from silence, overreadings, and a preference for complex over simple theories. theories. If your discussion partner has some time or is willing to read some articles later, it's really easy to provide numerous examples and how they can be resolved. At most, Ehrman's long, scary list of errors shrinks from 50 or 60 to perhaps 5 or 6. Those cases merit and have received plenty of thoughtful scholarly attention. The presence of such a small number of errors would not by themselves impugn the core historical integrity of the narratives. This is true even if we were to call them errors without further investigation. I mean, seriously, how difficult is that to say in a discussion or a debate? The reasons why scholars often reject the Gospels of the Book of Acts just normally aren't very good. For an example, here is a video in the corner of me replying to scholar Paula Friedrichsen about the reliability of the Book of Acts. So what do you guys think? Am I getting Habermas wrong? Is there something that I'm missing here? Let me know in the comments.